In the literal roller coaster that is President Trump's second administration, we now have a reversal from the administration on its stance towards Nvidia selling advanced AI chips into China. And in fact, it's a major reversal. Now, I'm going to get into this and why it's such a big decision based on the history of this administration and the prior two. But first, I want to welcome you to Ruben Tech, where we're the only channel on YouTube that meets at the intersection of tech, politics, and finance. Please be sure to like and subscribe down below. Now, President Trump had announced on Truth Social that Jensen Huang's Nvidia could go ahead and sell not the H20s, but the H200s into China. You have to understand how big of an announcement this was. The H200s are the top of the line Hopper series. Now, you might say, wait a second, we're on Grace Blackwell and we have Vera Rubin coming. But the simple fact is that just earlier this year, Nvidia was blocked from selling the H20s, which is a reduced version of the H100s. Understand that President Trump and his first administration had set out to destroy Huawei, i.e., America was trying to limit the ambition of the Chinese people in the high-tech sector. And President Biden was also all on board with this. In fact, Nvidia was banned under not just President Trump, but President Biden from exporting their most advanced chips into China. And in order to comply with these rules, Nvidia worked with Biden's administration to create special versions of its Hopper series that were reduced. These versions were seen as safer to selling to the Chinese people so that Nvidia could still capture market share, they could still capture revenue. However, China wouldn't have access to our most advanced versions of our AI accelerators. And this seemed to be working. China had a lot of pent-up demand for the H20s. But as we discussed earlier, President Trump's second administration came in earlier this year and killed that dream. What specifically happened was President Trump reversed course on the sales of the H20s, and then at the same time, he imposed sanctions against Huawei. Now understand that Huawei is already one of the most sanctioned companies on the entire planet of Earth. And a declaration from the US government, which I covered in detail on this channel, the Trump administration laid forth that anybody in the world caught using these accelerators could face sanctions from the United States government, i.e. imprisonment, confinement, detainment, and of course, financial penalties. Absolutely insane. And before you think, how can they do that? Again, we've covered the story of the Huawei princess and how Canada actually arrested her at the behest of a New York-based judge. But the insanity does not stop there, because Jensen Huang understood that if you're going to have an AI war against China, you're not going to win by trying to penalize them and hold them back. It simply was not going to work. So he started making pleadings to David Sachs and President Trump's administration, specifically making the argument that if we really wanted to win this AI war, this AI race, what we needed to do was get the Chinese hooked on our software, i.e. on CUDA. Because whoever controls the standards controls the direction of the race. And to be perfectly honest, Jensen is absolutely correct. Now, if the Chinese got hooked on open source from America, that wouldn't be a big deal because they could just fork it and go their own way. But CUDA is not open source, it's proprietary, which means if they're using this for development, they are reliant on Nvidia and whatever direction Nvidia wants to take with this software. That is a significant deal, and it's possible that President Trump started to understand this a little bit because then in late July, what happened was his administration reversed course and decided to allow the sales of some AI accelerators back into China, i.e. the sale of H20s were on again to Beijing. However, that even came with a very odd twist in the form of a 15% something from Nvidia and AMD that had to be given to the US government whenever they sold one of these devices. Now, you would call this a tax, but technically you can't because the United States Constitution is crystal clear, much more clear on this than it is with tariffs, that export taxes are absolutely not allowed in any way, shape, or form, i.e. they simply cannot happen. And so they are not able to call this officially an export tax. I don't know what else you could call it, so we will just call it one here. but I don't really know what the official name of it is. Beijing was tired of these back and forths with President Trump and his regime. So what they basically said was, we do not want your H20s, as they started issuing guidance to all of their local companies to not use Nvidia's hardware. Now, obviously, this must have been a real kick in the nuts to Jensen Huang, because he had correctly told the Trump administration that they should not go down this path, because the standards are what matters, not the hardware. And here he had China now telling him, hey, we don't even want your chips. We're going to go ahead and go off and blaze our own trail. And not only did they do that, but they went one step further. This September at Huawei Connect, Huawei showed that on a chip-by-chip basis, they might not be able to keep up with Nvidia, but they'll be able to surpass Nvidia on a systems basis. And this is extremely important. You see, because Huawei leads the world in interconnects, moving the data around the system. And this allows them to hook up more accelerators, so they win by sheer brute force. Now, I know what you may be thinking. You may say, but doesn't that use more energy? Well, yes, of course it does. But here again, China is flexing its muscle as they produce 2.25 times the amount of energy as the US last year. And not only that, but they have a planned 9-to-1 deployment in new energy areas. If you want to visually see China's dominance in energy, I would recommend coming over to the Kardashev scale of economies, which I, yours truly, developed. I'll have a link to it down below. Yes, this is a shameless plug. I have no advertiser except for myself. Over here, we can see on the Kardashev scale that China is actually the world's leading economy. And it's not even close. Remember that this is a logarithmic scale, so even small amounts in increase are actually big numbers. And then if we look at a change in electricity generation, i.e. the amount of electricity brought online in the last 12 months compared to the prior 12 months, the change in that, we can see that China has led the way with over half of the world's brand new deployment. And the US is way down here at 1/4 of what China has. And to make matters even worse, as I stated earlier, China has a planned 9-to-1 deployment. But we're not here to talk about how the US is lagging in energy all day. Instead, let's talk about this announcement. It happened 2 days ago, but I wanted to wait until I heard from Beijing. And what happened in China is that regulators called major tech firms to discuss the demand for H200s, and it is being reported that China is seeing a lot of people very interested. However, from what we understand, regulators are saying that buyers must justify why domestic chips aren't sufficient. In fact, Beijing wants to continue its campaign for independent and controllable tech, urging use of homegrown chips. What does this mean? Beijing has heard the message loud and clear. They understand that if they get American technology, the urge to use CUDA will be nigh irresistible, and they don't want to get locked into that. So we can see that at a minimum, regulators plan to ban the H200s from government entities, and that Beijing sees this reliance on US chips as a long-term strategic weakness, despite these performance advantages. So what does all of this mean? Well, simply put, right now, the US does have the best chips, and we also have the best systems. So there's no doubt that companies such as Alibaba and Tencent would love to get their hands on these chips. But the simple fact is that Beijing is playing a very cautious game because they understand, plain and simple, that to allow their companies to depend on US chips means that they're held hostage to US whims and demands. And over the past year, with what they've experienced with the volatile regime of the President Trump administration, you can imagine that that's not a situation that they wish to be in. Now, from the US side, we have something very odd here. Yes, it's actually a good thing if you're into these tech kind of wars, because Jensen, again, was absolutely correct. The hardware is not as important as the standards. So what you're looking to do is get the H200s, I would say even get Grace Blackwell's into as many hands as possible, and then let CUDA do the dirty work. However, this export tax is very odd. The fact that AMD and Nvidia are going to be paying 25% of all sales to the government is, to me, extremely scary. Because where do you want this capital? Do you want it in the responsible hands of companies that are going to invest and do better things with it? Or the US government's hands, which is probably just going to put it into some kind of crypto Ponzi? I don't know. You can be the judge. But there is another problem here, and it has to deal with Washington. There are, simply put, lawmakers on both sides that are anti-China hawks, and they absolutely do not want to see this deal go through. Even so much that people in President Trump's own party, which he owns body and soul, are actually growing a spine and starting to reject this idea. They might come together with the Democrats, form a coalition, and try to block these sales. So let me know what you think now about all this down in the comments, and I will see you there. Have a great day.